Hey guys, today I'll be showing you how to use Ubuntu's automated installation feature. This video has been a very long time in the making. I'm not only going to show you how to specify the autoinstall.yaml file in the installer, I'm also going to show you an example autoinstall configuration, which I'll have linked in the description. And I'll also have other resources to help you write an autoinstall.yaml file in the description. And I'll also show you how to do an automated installation on Ubuntu Server. Anyways, let's get right into the video.
Alright, so the first thing we gotta do before we can do an automated installation is write an autoinstall.yaml file. Now what I've done is I've written kind of an example autoinstall.yaml, and I've included pretty much every configuration option in here, with a couple of exceptions that I'll get into later. And this is based on the autoinstall configuration reference manual, which I'll have linked in the description. I strongly encourage you to go check that out, but I'll go over what I've done here. So the only part that you absolutely must have in your autoinstall.yaml file is this little snippet right here. And basically, you start off your autoinstall file with autoinstall here. Then what you're going to have to do is go down a line, and now you use either 2 or 4 spaces to indent it. And you have to use spaces because YAML files do not accept tabs. And you can use either 2 or 4 spaces. Both are acceptable, but then you got to use the same number of spaces throughout. Like, you can't flip-flop between using 2 and 4 spaces for indents, if that makes sense. YAML files are very sensitive about spaces, and they do not accept tabs. But then you indent and then put in version 1, and what this does is it defines the version of the autoinstall configuration, and this is necessary for future-proofing. Currently, this has to be set to 1. And now, the most important part is the identity section. So you start this off with identity, then go down, indent like that, and then the options are real name, username, password, and host name. So real name is your full name, and this part can include spaces, but you have to put it in quotes. Like, for example, Drew Howden. And then username is the same as the username field in the installer. For this, you have to be all one word, all lowercase, but you don't have to put it in quotation marks. So, for example, I like to set my username to Drew. Again, all one word, all lowercase, no spaces or capitals. And I don't think you can have any special characters in there other than hyphens, but I could be wrong. And then we come to the password field, which the trick is that you don't put in the password that you actually want here. What you have to do is you put in a password hash here, which you can generate with the openSSL PASSWD command, which I'm going to go demonstrate right now. You just go into a Linux terminal, then type openSSL PASSWD, and then punch in the password that you want. And then you go copy this hash and paste it here. And this hash represents the password with a capital P. Very secure, I know. I would change this if I were you. And then for hostname, well, that's your computer name. And again, this is something that has to be all one word, all lowercase, but it doesn't have to be in quotes. And it's pretty much the same principle as the username. And the reason why the password hash has to be in quotes is to ensure that the installer parses it out correctly. Okay, so now we're done with like our required configuration. So now let's go to optional configuration, which if you leave any of this stuff out from here onward, then the installer will just use the defaults for those configuration options as specified in the autoinstall configuration reference manual. So first is interactive sessions. options, and that's a list of screens to still show during installation. Like, for example, I might still want to show the network screen, because that configuration could be different depending on where I'm installing Ubuntu. For that, you just do an indent, hyphen, space, and then the configuration option that you want being interactive. Now, word of warning, not all configuration options can be interactive, only certain ones can be. To see which ones can or can't be interactive, read the auto install configuration reference manual. And now we come down to early commands, and this allows you to provide a list of commands to run before the installation starts. So, for example, what you can do here is, again, you just indent it, tab, and then enter the command. And you can specify multiple, but each one has to have a hyphen and a space before it. Like, for example, this command will allow you to replace this autoinstall.yaml with one provided by a centralized server. But be sure to replace this with the actual URL of the autoinstall.yaml file. Now, I've commented this out because I'm not actually using this. This is just an example. And now we come to storage, which is actually another section you might want interactive, because it might change depending on the system. Warning, this will erase the entire disk. I don't know of a way to have it to do a dual boot with this, where it only erases a specified partition but leaves the other partition intact. If you know, please leave it down in the comments below. If there is a way to do it, I couldn't find it in the manual. But then you go layout, and then name is the type of storage configuration you want to use. I'm using LVM in this example, which is the default. And by the way, anything I have it commented default here, that means that this is the default setting that the installer will use if this is not specified. Now, if you don't want to use an LVM layout, then another option is to do a direct layout. And if you're using an LVM layout, then you can also specify a sizing policy. I've set this to all, which tells it to use the whole disk. If you don't specify this and use an LVM layout, then by default, it'll only use a portion of the disk and then leave the rest unallocated, which can be useful for some use cases to allow for additional partitions without having to shrink your existing one. But if you want to use the whole disk, which I'm assuming most of you do, then that can be kind of annoying if you're not aware of it. And if you specify a password here, then the installer will set up full disk encryption with this passphrase. And for this, you don't need to put a hash here, you just put in the passphrase that you want in clear text. Now, I think you have to be using an LVM layout for this to work, but I could be wrong. And now we come down to the match spec, which will allow you to specify some characteristics that identify the disk that you want to use. And I've listed out all the options here. Check the auto install configuration reference manual to see how to use those. Now, if this is not included, then the installer will just use the largest disk in the system. You might want your target installation disk to be the only disk in the system if you're going to use an auto install, unless you make storage interactive, which would also allow you to do something like a dual boot. Now, I've left all of these uncommented because you can't have blank options in your autoinstall.yaml file, otherwise the installation will fail. All except for size, which I've set to largest, which is the default. And now we come down to keyboard, and there are a couple of options here. There's your layout, which I've set to US English, which is the default, and variant will allow you to specify the variant of your chosen keyboard layout if there's multiple variants of your chosen keyboard layout. Now, I've just left this blank because there is only one US English keyboard layout, so variant is not applicable in this case. And going back to what I said here about having blanks, this is one blank that is acceptable, but if you aren't using this, then you don't have to have it specified. Right? And similarly, if you're using a US English keyboard layout, then you don't need to have this whole thing specified. I just put it in here as an example. And then the locale option, as the name suggests, sets the locale for your system. And in this example, I'm using English US with the UTF-8 character encoding, which is the default. And you can change this to your local locale. For example, here in Canada, I would actually change this to en_ca.utf8, which would use Canadian English, because I'm in Canada. And then time zone specifies your time zone setting, and UTC or ETC/UTC is the default, but you should set this to your local time zone. Like, for example, where I am, I would set this to America/Toronto, because I'm in Eastern time. Now, this should go without saying, but set this to your time zone. Like, for example, like, if you live in India, you're not gonna go America/Toronto. No. You're gonna put in a city close to you. To figure out what exactly to put in to the time zone field, depending on where you are in the world, just go to any Linux system, then go to the root directory, and then usr share zone info, and then find your region, for example, America, and then find the city closest to you. In my example, Toronto. So from zone info, I went into America/Toronto, and that's how I know to put America/Toronto here, if that makes sense. And the refresh installer portion allows you to control whether the installer updates to a new version before continuing. And if you set this to true, which channel the update is downloaded from. So I have update set to true, and then channel is the stable channel, which is the default. And then under source, and then ID, this allows you to specify the variant of Ubuntu to be installed. So for example, I have my ID set to Ubuntu-Desktop, which installs the extended installation of Ubuntu Desktop. Now, word of warning, this is only valid for the vanilla Ubuntu Desktop ISO. So check the auto install configuration reference manual for valid values on other versions of Ubuntu. For example, if you're installing Ubuntu Server, if you have your source ID as Ubuntu Desktop, your installation will fail. So what you have to do is set it to Server, which is the default on server installations. Now, the default on desktop installations is Ubuntu Desktop Minimal, which does the default, or formerly minimal, installation of Ubuntu Desktop. And now we come down to network, and for this you provide a netplan formatted network configuration. If you don't have this specified, by default, it'll just use DHCP auto configuration on Ethernet interfaces. Now, I'll link the netplan configuration manual in the description below, so go check that out if you want to tinker with this. Under network, you also need to specify a version, which currently must be set to 2, again, for future proofing. And then renderer, which controls the backend that netplan uses, which can be either network D or network manager. The default is to use network D. However, on a desktop installation, I would use network manager. And now for Ethernets, this configures our Ethernet interfaces. So now what I've done here is I've just put wired here and then specify a match spec to match any Ethernet card in the system. If you want to specify an interface, then you can just strike out this whole match spec and then replace this with your Ethernet interface name. And here I've gone through what it's like to configure a statically assigned IP address. And the IP address I've used is 192.168.0.2, which may or may not work for you depending on how your network is set up and if that IP is used already. And the /24 here, this is Ubuntu's way of specifying the subnet mask, which /24 represents the subnet mask 255.255.255.0, which is what it is on most home networks. If your subnet mask is different, then you can go check out a subnet calculator to determine what to put here. And you can check your subnet mask on another device connected to your network. And then name servers, this is where you specify the IP addresses of your DNS servers. So what I've done is I'm using Cloudflare's DNS servers as an example. So for each line, you just, of course, indent, hyphen, space, and then the IP address. And now we come down to routes, which is where you configure your default gateway. Just put routes, indent, hyphen, space, and then 2, set this to default. And then you make another line called via, and then line this up with where the word to begins, like so. You would indent, then put 2 spaces here, regardless of whether you're using 2 or 4 spaces for indents. And now I've set my gateway address to 192.168.0.1 in this example, but be sure to replace this with your actual gateway address if it's different. And you can check this on another computer connected to your network. Since I'm showing a manual configuration here, I've disabled DHCP for IPv4, but I've left DHCP enabled for IPv6 since I still want to automatically obtain the IPv6 configuration. Now for a desktop installation, what I would do is I would just set both DHCP4 and DHCP6 to true, and then just get rid of all of this here, which this is the default for our Ethernets. And now as for Wi-Fi's, which you might want on an Ubuntu Desktop installation, now I've just made up an interface called wireless, and I've set this to match to any wireless card in the system. Now, word of warning, unlike with Ethernets, when it comes to Wi-Fi's, the match spec only works if you're using Network Manager as your renderer. If you're using Network D, like for a server installation, then you unfortunately have to specify a wireless interface manually. If you're doing a server installation of Ubuntu, most likely you're going to be using a wired connection, so this wouldn't be an issue for you. And here I have this configured to use an automatic IP configuration with DHCP. And then the most important part of this is to specify your access points. And then you just tab and then put quotation marks here. And then type in your network's SSID. And then password, you just put your Wi-Fi password in quotes. And this is all you need to connect to a Wi-Fi network, at least on the desktop. If you're doing this on Ubuntu Server, then you need to install the WPA supplicant package. And I've made a whole video on how to connect a Ubuntu Server system to a Wi-Fi network, which includes installing the WPA supplicant package without needing to already have a wired internet connection in place. But again, what I would do for a desktop is set my renderer to Network Manager and then set both my Ethernets and my Wi-Fi's to DHCP automatic IP configuration, and then just strike this out to not make network interactive. And if you have no other interactive sections, then you gotta remove interactive sections. Otherwise, your installation will fail because it doesn't like just blanks. But that's it for that. Now we come down to APT, which specifies our APT configuration. Now I'm just showing the default here as an example. So even if you were to strike this whole thing out, this is the configuration that it would use. Now, only thing I'm going to note here is that if you specify country mirror here to have it automatically select your local country's mirror, the GeoIP setting has to be true, which it is by default. And now as for Active Directory, which is another one I'm not using in this example, this allows you to configure an Active Directory domain. You just specify your admin name and domain name. And now if you want to set up Ubuntu Pro, then you go to ubuntu.com/pro/dashboard, log into your Ubuntu One account, and then that will give you a token, which you copy and paste into here. Now note that this is not a valid contract token, so if you actually want to enable Ubuntu Pro, be sure to replace this with an actual contract token. This is just a dummy example I took from the auto install configuration reference manual, which is just provided for illustrative purposes, but it doesn't actually activate Ubuntu Pro on the target system. And now for our SSH settings, the default is just to not install OpenSSH-server, which is good on the desktop. Now on a server, you might want to set this to true, and for added security, you might want to provide an SSH public key here to install in the initial user account. And then if you're going to do that, I would set allow PW to false to not allow password authentication over SSH. By default, this is set to true. Now the codecs setting allows you to specify whether to install the Ubuntu restricted add-ons package, which this is set to false by default, but I've set it to true. Similarly with drivers, this allows you to choose whether to install third-party drivers. Again, this is false by default, but I've set it to true. And now for packages, this allows you to specify additional packages to install on the target system. For example, this will install the CMatrix package. And now, while we're on packages, now we come down to snaps, which will allow you to provide a list of snaps to install on the target system. For snaps, unlike with packages, you have to put name here. So what this will do is this will install the hello world snap. And there's a couple additional options under snaps. You can choose which channel to install the snap from: stable, candidate, beta, or edge. By default, it'll use stable. And then the classic option, which can be true or false, it basically controls whether or not to use classic confinement. And by default, this is set to false, which tells it to use standard confinement, or rather, not to use classic confinement, which is the most secure setting. And now here's another one that I'm not using, the kernel parameter. Basically, this will allow you to specify a particular kernel package or flavor to install if you'd like. And now the updates option will allow you to choose which updates are downloaded and installed after the system is installed, which you can either have this set to security if you want to do only security updates, which is the default, or you can set this to all, like I've did, to install all updates. And now for the shutdown option, this controls whether to reboot or shut down the system. By default, it'll reboot the system after installation. If you want to shut down the system after installation, you'd replace reboot with power off here. And now we come down to late commands, which allows you to provide a list of commands to run after the installation has completed successfully, and successfully is a keyword here. Like, for example, you could have this set to pause the installation just before finishing to allow for manual inspection and modification, and then unpause it by creating the /run/finish file. Pretty much similar principle with the early commands, only it runs after installation, not before. And now here's error commands, which I actually do use for a reason. And this provides a list of commands to run after the installation has failed. And what I've done here is collect installer logs and the live system journal. And when I was writing this file, I actually ran into a lot of issues, and having this specified was invaluable because that allowed me to more easily identify the issue with my autoinstall.yaml file. And now finally, the last option I have specified here is whether to enable kernel crash dumps. I have this set to false, which is the default, at least for now. But in Ubuntu 24.10 and later, the default is to enable kernel crash dumps dynamically. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what this is used for, because I really don't. But it's more just, I think you should be aware that this option does exist. Now, there are a couple of options that I left out, because I'm really not sure how to use these. And those are the last two in the manual. These are the reporting options. For example, what you can do is, instead of it just showing progress on the screen, you can have it instead output to a remote server. And then there's the user data option, which is a more advanced way of configuring the initial user account or initial user accounts, because this will actually allow you to configure multiple accounts. But this has a lot of options here, which I imagine most of you are not going to need to mess with. And another interesting thing is that if you specify a user data section, then you don't need to specify an identity section. So that's why I chose to leave that out, because the identity section is just much simpler for beginners. Okay, but anyway, that's my autoinstall.yaml file. Once we have that created, all we got to do is provide it. To do that, just put in your Ubuntu installation media, and then what I'm going to do is go into a partition manager and then create a partition on it that fills up the remaining space. You can call this whatever you want. I'll just call it autoinstall. And you can format this with any file system of your choice, doesn't really matter, and then create it. And now on your newly created partition, just simply place your autoinstall.yaml file on it. And that's the only file you need on here. So now this is my Ubuntu Desktop installer. And by the way, if you would like, you can put your autoinstall.yaml file on a separate drive, but it might be easiest just to have it on the same drive, which I imagine would be pretty easy given that autoinstall.yaml files are very tiny. But anyway, now all you have to do once you've done that is just eject that drive. And now all you do is go to the system that you want to install on, and then you just boot from your installation medium, just as if you're doing a normal installation. Alright, now once the installation screen pops up, you're actually going to close out of it, and then you're going to open up your autoinstall partition that you've created, so that way it's mounted in the live system. Now, if you don't do this step, then when you specify your autoinstall.yaml file, the installer won't be able to find it. But then all you do now is right-click your autoinstall.yaml file, go to Properties, and then take note of the parent folder. You might want to copy this, and then go back into the installer, and then just go through it as normal. Select your language, keyboard layout, up until you get to this screen, type of installation, where it asks, how would you like to install Ubuntu? And instead of selecting interactive installation like normal, you're going to select automated installation, and then you specify the URL of your autoinstall.yaml file. In our case, since we're specifying a local file, we're going to start this with file : and this tells it that we're specifying a local file. Then the path to our autoinstall.yaml file, which in our case is /media/ubuntu/autoinstall. And by the way, the case matters in file paths on Linux. /autoinstall.yaml. After file : you should have 3 slashes. And by the way, this will allow you to specify an autoinstall.yaml file on a remote server. So you could just have a central server providing configuration options for your entire fleet of Linux workstations. But anyway, we're going to validate our file. It may take a little bit to do that. And then it's basically going to give us what we put in our autoinstall.yaml file to allow us to review our choices. And then we just click install and then just let it go. All right, so now once our installation is done, it will just automatically reboot the system. And because I've chosen to set up full disk encryption, it's now prompting me for my encryption passphrase. All right, now that we're at the login screen, we can see our name that we've specified in our autoinstall.yaml file. And now I'm going to log in with my super secure password. And then we'll just go through the initial setup real quick. And as you may notice that Ubuntu Pro is not enabled, because even though we specified a contract token, that contract token isn't actually valid. And it looks like, yep, CMatrix is installed. And if you go into terminal, then, yep, we have our username and host name that we specified in our autoinstall.yaml. And even the hello world command works. And if I go into software updater, I can see that the software on this computer is fully up to date, even though this is a fresh installation. So now I'm going to power this off and then get to the next part of the video. Now, if you want to do this on a server, there's some changes we have to make. The most important one is we have to change this source ID, Ubuntu Desktop, to Ubuntu Server. If you don't do this, the installation will fail. And then there is some other stuff I would change. What I would do is I would just set the network portion as an interactive session, which will allow me to configure a static IP address at the time of installation, which would give me the opportunity to check, is that IP address already assigned? And since that's an interactive portion, we can actually just take out this whole network portion, like so. And if you're doing this on a server, then you might not want full disk encryption, so you can just remove this password line, and that's pretty much it. So, same principle. We just put in our Ubuntu Server installation medium, open up our partitioning software, and then make a new partition out of the free space on our installation medium, and then just copy that autoinstall.yaml file to that partition. All right, and then once we're in the Ubuntu Server installer, we're going to go all the way up to Help on the top right corner, and then enter shell. Okay, now once we're there, we're going to do an lsblk to identify our installation medium. So as we could see, SDA1 is mounted at /CD-ROM. That's where our installation medium is mounted. And the partition that we created, which we put our autoinstall.yaml on, would be the very last partition, SDA4. So let's mount that by doing mount /dev/sda4/mnt. Okay, so now that we have that partition mounted, we can do an ls/mnt, and we see, yep, there's our autoinstall.yaml file. So now we're gonna copy, so cp/mnt/autoinstall.yaml to our root directory with just a /. And if we do an ls, yep, now our autoinstall.yaml file is in our root directory. Note, this is not a permanent change, and our autoinstall.yaml file will disappear from our root directory when we reboot the system. To actually start the automated installation, what we have to do is restart Subiquity, which is the installation program. This is not the same as rebooting the system. To do that, we have to figure out what the service name for Subiquity is. To do that, we're going to do systemctl list-units, and then pipe, then grep Subiquity. Then hit enter, so we can see that it is snap-subiquity-6066.mount. Note that this may change in future versions of Ubuntu. And then you're going to do systemctl restart snap subiquity 6066.mount, and you have to include the .mount here, otherwise this won't work. Now hit enter, and now the Ubuntu server installer will now restart. Now we've just started our automated installation, and we know this since it jumps straight to our network configuration, which is our only interactive session. But then here, what we can do is we can now go set a static IP for our server if we'd like. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to leave this as default and then hit done. And then once it's ready to start the installation, it'll get you to confirm the formatting of the drive, right? And note that the largest disk in the system is used by default. Once you're ready, hit continue. And please note this does actually erase the whole disk again. All right, now our installation's done, and for some reason this time around it didn't reboot the system automatically, so we're gonna do that right now. And now, because we didn't set up full disk encryption this time around, it just boots us straight into the login screen. So we're gonna type in our username and password. All right, now that we're in, I can see that, yep, it used up the whole of my little bitty 25 gig drive that I allocated to this VM, and there is a little bit of space lost to the boot partition, and it auto-configured the network for us. I'll ping google.com to show that, yep, it works, and I'll run cmatrix, and yep, that is installed. Same with hello world. Yep, that is installed. And if we do a sudo apt update, we can see that, yep, all packages are up to date. So now I'm gonna power off this VM and get into one final thing with this video. So now I'm gonna show you a way to create a custom Ubuntu server ISO that'll just automatically run your autoinstall.yaml file. To do that, we're going to go into terminal. Just a warning, this process is very complicated, but I'll try to walk you through it as best I can. So first of all, you're going to do a sudo apt install p7zip and xorriso. And like this installation command is assuming you're on a Debian-based Linux distribution. So now once we've got those installed, what we're gonna do is cd into our desktop, and you can put this in any directory you like. Like it doesn't have to be in your desktop, but this is where we're gonna be working from. So now I'm gonna do mkdir -p, whatever name you want. I'm gonna call this autoinstall-server /source-files, and then hit enter. And now if you didn't put the -p, then it'll give you a no such file or directory error. The -p just tells it to create any non-existent directories. But now if I minimize my terminal window and then come to my desktop, I now have an autoinstall-server directory. And in that, I have a source files directory. So now I'm going to go back to my terminal and then cd into my autoinstall-server directory. And now what I'm going to do is grab my Ubuntu Server ISO and then copy that to my autoinstall-server directory. And now you're going to go back into the terminal and do 7z-y x and then the name of your Ubuntu server ISO, and then space -o source-files. Note that there is no space between the -o and the source files. Then hit enter, and then it'll extract your ISO file to the source files directory. So now if I come back to my file manager and I go into the source files directory, I now have the contents of the Ubuntu Server ISO extracted here, along with 2 boot directories. So this boot directory is the boot directory that's actually used by the Ubuntu Server ISO, so we're going to leave that alone. This boot directory is actually images of the boot partitions on the Ubuntu Server ISO. So what we're going to do is we're going to move that out of our source files directory and then just into the root of our autoinstall-server directory. And we're going to remove those square brackets just to make it a little bit easier to work with in terminal. We're going to go grab our autoinstall.yaml file and paste it into our source files directory, which will be the root of our Ubuntu Server autoinstall ISO. And this has to be called autoinstall.yaml exactly, otherwise it won't find it. And now I'm going to come back into my terminal and then type xorriso-indev and then the name of our Ubuntu Server ISO dash report underscore el underscore torito space as underscore mkisofs. Then press enter. Now it'll give you a bunch of information about our Ubuntu Server ISO. The only thing we need to concern ourselves with is this stuff right here that I'm highlighting, like below the volume ID. So we're going to copy all this and paste it into a text editor, because there are some modifications we need to make. So first of all, at the bottom, we're going to make a new line and then type source-files to tell it to grab the files from our source files directory. Now at the top, I'm just going to go to the very beginning, hit enter to make a new line at the top, and then type xorriso dash as mkisofs dash r. And now we're going to come to our second line, hit enter to make a new line, and then type dash o, whatever name you want to give your autoinstall ISO. I'm just going to call it autoinstall-server.iso. And now come to the line that says grub2-mbr, and then highlight everything on that line from -- interval onward. We're going to remove that and then put our boot folder that houses our boot partition images, and then 1-boot-no emul.img. And that's the file that stores our legacy BIOS boot partition. And now come down to the line that says append_partition2, and then highlight everything from -- interval onward. Don't highlight this portion, just -- interval onward. Get rid of that, and then replace it with boot/2-boot-no emul.img. And note that the case matters in file names, so you have to ensure that you get the capitalization right. Otherwise, you'll get file not found errors when you go to create your ISO. And now the very, very last thing we're going to do is just put a space and then a backward slash at the end of every line, like so. Every line except for our very last line that just says source files. And now this is what we'll copy and paste into our terminal to actually create our ISO. Copy this whole long command and then paste it into our terminal window. Then hit enter, and then it'll start creating our Ubuntu Server autoinstall ISO. And now if we come back to our autoinstall-server directory, we now have a file called autoinstall-server.iso, or whatever name you chose for your autoinstall-server ISO. And then if we look into that, we can see that, yep, our autoinstall.yaml file is there. So now we can close out of everything that we had open. And now we can test this ISO in a VM. I'm just gonna select my autoinstall-server ISO that we created. Add that as a storage device. And then make sure that that's a boot option in our VM. And then I'll boot it up and then boot from that ISO. And as we can see, it just went straight to our network configuration, meaning that it saw our autoinstall.yaml file. And I'll just start this just to show that it is auto installing. But as we could see, it works.
Now, I did try creating an auto install ISO for Ubuntu Desktop, but it didn't work for me. The installer just crashed. Your mileage may vary. But anyway, that's it for this video. Be sure to give it a like if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and see you next time.